In the previous session, we looked at the narrative from Exodus chapter 1 to 3, where we're introduced to the plot. It's kind of God versus Pharaoh, delivering his people out from underneath the oppression of the evil powers. And it's done through the person of Moses, who we're introduced as the one who draws the people out. Now, in this next session, we're going to see how God is going to do that through Moses, and how Moses' journey, right, at his time in the wilderness at the burning bush, kind of anticipates Israel's one-day journey out of Egypt into the wilderness, where they will also meet God at a similar place. So the plagues, they're one of the most famous parts of the Old Testament, really. Like we know them, we don't know all of them, but we know the narrative. But it's very interesting how God sets up the narrative of the plagues with chapters 5 and 6. So chapter 5 is now Moses' second attempt at delivering the people. If you remember from the previous session, chapter 2, Moses at the age of 40 thinks he can do it, right? And it seems as if he's taking it into his own hands. 40 years later, after being a shepherd in the wilderness, learning about God, learning how his people should be led, he returns, and you should expect success. You should expect something different. Now, again, we have very parallel and very interesting three responses. Another way to look at it is kind of this continuity, that it's repetitive. And so the first one is Moses shows up to Pharaoh and says that the Lord, the God of Israel, that's his specific name, right? Yahweh, that's different from all these other gods, has asked us to come out into the wilderness. Pharaoh's response in 5 verse 2 is, who is the Lord? Right? Who is the Lord? Okay? In Pharaoh's mind, he's the God of the people, or at least the representative of the one in control of the people. So who is this other Lord? Who is this other person that you're meant to be taking and receiving orders from? And Pharaoh's response comes in 5 verse 9. Let heavier work be laid on the men, that they may labor at it and pay no regard to lying words. So that's the response, right? 40 years in the wilderness, Moses comes back equipped with, God's anointing, God sending him out, and Pharaoh is like, yeah, no, who's the Lord? I'm in charge here. No, thank you. And then the response of the people, Moses' own people, in 5 verse 21. After they've been further oppressed by Pharaoh, there's this continuity. They respond in likewise to Pharaoh, and they're rejecting God's plan. Verse 21, and they said to him, the Lord look on you and judge, because you have made us a stink in the sight of Pharaoh and his servants, and have put a sword in their hands to kill us. Right? Moses, what are you doing? We don't want this. We didn't ask for you to save us this way. Then Moses' response. This is interesting, and we'll come back to it later on. But Moses follows in the pattern of these negative response. And in verse 22 it says, Moses turned to the Lord, and notice what he says. O Lord, why have you done evil to this people? Why did you ever send me? For since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has done evil to this people, and you have not delivered your people at all. You have not delivered your people at all. Keyword there, delivered, right? That's what God is going to do. He's going to deliver. And Moses is saying, you have not done that. And so in this chapter leading up to the plagues, Moses comes back after 40 years in the wilderness, learning and being equipped by the Lord, and he should expect to succeed, right? But he fails miserably. And in his failure, he shakes his fist at God and says, you've done nothing. And this is relatively easy to apply to our lives. We may think that the moment we step out into obedience, we're guaranteed success because God's called us to that. But God's setting the stage for his glory and not our own glory. And sometimes that means mistakes at the beginning or setbacks at the beginning to prepare the stage for God to come through in an incredible way. So we must never give up after initial failures. And Moses comes closer, but God answers his question. You've done nothing at all is how chapter 5 ends. Chapter 6 is God's response to Moses' accusation. And notice the response. And here it's great. You can observe a list of what God has done. And you can organize it in the past, in the present and in the future. So Moses has said, you've done nothing at all to deliver the people. And then God's response is, actually, I've done a lot in the past, and I'm doing a lot in the present, and wait until you see what I'm doing in the future. It's an incredible answer to Moses' question. Let's take a look. So what has God done in the past? And you can observe this as a good list. In the past, verse 3, I appeared to Abraham, and then Isaac and Jacob. And then verse 4, I also established my covenant. Okay, so that's what he's done in the past. He's shown himself to his people, and he's promised them certain things. The covenant that he's referring to probably is out of Genesis chapter 15, where God says, after 4 generations, after the sins of the people in Canaan are complete, I will deliver you out of Egypt. So when Moses is saying, you've done nothing, God says, actually, I've made a promise that I know very well of, and I'm not walking away from that. Then what is God doing in the present because of the covenant he's made? That's in verse 5. I have heard the groaning of my people. Okay? And then at the end of verse 5, and I have remembered my covenant. I've heard their cries and I've remembered. God's not distant. Right? God's not disappeared from his people. God's not just reserving himself to the past of the God of their fathers. He's presently hearing their cries. He's their God, and he's remembered the covenant he made with their fathers, but that also counts for them. Think of the question, you've done nothing at all. In the past I promised, in the present I'm here. And now look what God says he will do in the future. Okay? This is beginning in verse 6. I will deliver. I will redeem. Verse 7. You shall know that I am the Lord. Verse 8. I will bring you into the land I swore to give your fathers. Okay? And so there's these promises of what God promises to do in the future. I will bring you out. I will deliver. I will redeem. I will take you to be my people. And I will give you the land. These are the promises that he had given to the patriarchs. And notice these promises for the future, they're kind of bracketed with the phrase, I am the Lord. You see that at the beginning in verse 6, I am the Lord. And then you see it at the very end of verse 8, I am the Lord. So God's saying these present acts of rescue and deliverance, right? They're bracketed by the phrase, I am the Lord. Remember what we saw in the last session, okay? I am the Lord. The Lord is this phrase, I am who I am, or I will be who I will be. And so it's almost as if God's saying, because of what I'm going to show you, you're going to see, you're going to learn that I am the God who delivers. I am the God who redeems. Those 2 words, deliver and redeem, those are key words. You need to observe those as repeated key essential words through the whole book of Exodus. And so there's this continuity of in chapter 5 of Pharaoh rejecting Yahweh, of the people rejecting Yahweh's plan. And then Moses himself turning to God and saying, where are you? You haven't done anything. Then chapter 6 is the answer to the question. Well, I've done stuff in the past. I'm doing stuff in the present, and I will continue to do great things in the near future. Now, this continuity, this progression is going to be repeated again on the shores of the Red Sea, but Moses' response is different. The peoples and Pharaoh's will still be the same. We'll get there in the coming session. So, chapter 6 doesn't say what he's going to do. It kind of leaves Moses in suspense of, okay, well, how is this going to happen? And there's so many moments in the book of Exodus where God says something and then there's just a hush waiting for that to come about. And so chapter 7, we come to the beginning of the plagues. Now, 7 verses 1 to 7 is kind of summarizing what's about to happen. It's introducing this next chunk of narrative. Okay? There's a few key observations in 4 verse 5 that I want to talk about. In verse 4, it says that God's going to bring the people out of the land of Egypt at the very end of verse 4 by great acts of judgment. That's a key word because it comes up a few times in this section. Okay? So the plagues are acts of judgment. What is God judging? Okay, or who is God judging? And you see it also in verse 6. Okay, I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great acts of judgment. Well, the question is, who is God judging? And what is God judging? Later on in Exodus 12, verse 12, and Numbers 33, verse 4, it says that God is executing judgment on the gods of Egypt. Meaning, these plagues aren't just random acts, not just, things that don't have any meaning associated with them. In God's eyes and in the eyes of the original hearers, the Egyptians and the Hebrews, these are acts of Yahweh, the God of Israel, judging the gods of Egypt. Remember, these are the gods that Israel grew up around, right? We have the God of our father, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the Egyptians have all of these other gods. And the question of Pharaoh, of who is the Lord, how does he relate to the gods of Egypt, right? The plagues answer that question. A key part of biblical narrative and large parts of the Bible is observing what we call connectors. Now, connectors are kind of like links in a chain, where they take one thought or one idea and then through a connector connect it to the next idea. And the idea of a connector and observing them helps you follow the flow of the argument or the flow of the narrative. And so we're going to look for these all over the text. They're very good to observe. I typically would put a circle around a connector or a square around a connector and it helps me follow the storyline, follow the message. And so one key connector shows purpose or result. Okay? And the words that show purpose and result are words like so that or thus. And so in the plagues, there's several connectors that show us the purpose of the plagues, right? I'm going to do this so that. Okay? The result of my action is this. And notice them here. 8 verse 10, God's going to send the plagues so that you may know there is no one like the Lord our God. 8 verse 22, that you may know I am the Lord. 9:14, so that you may know there is none like me in all the earth. 9:16, so that my name may be proclaimed in all the earth. 9:29, so that you may know the earth is the Lord's. Again, people aren't sure who Yahweh is. Now, the interesting part of this is that most of the purpose of the plagues are directed to the Egyptians knowing these things, right? Knowing who is the Lord, knowing that there's no one like him on the earth, knowing that the earth is the Lord's, knowing that the God of the Hebrews is far greater than the gods of the Egyptians. Now, isn't that interesting? God's purpose in the plagues is to reveal himself, not really to the Israelite people, but to reveal himself to the Egyptians. We read later on in chapter 12, verse 38, that a mixed multitude leaves Egypt. That means Egyptians joined in. They saw what God had done and they join in, because the purpose of the plagues is to reveal who Yahweh is, not just to the Hebrews, but to the nation of Egypt. So that's very interesting. As we enter in these plagues, we need to have these two things connected. That it's God judging the gods of Egypt, and the purpose is to bring about a revelation of who he is to the Egyptian people. Then there's a third purpose of the plague, and that's to bring distinction. Okay, there's several passages, Exodus 8:23 and 9:4 and 11:7, that say that God wants to bring a distinction. And these are the plagues that will only affect the Egyptian people and separate God's people from the Egyptians. Because again, we said, after 400 years, these lines will be somewhat blurred. And so that's the threefold purpose of the plagues: to bring judgment on the gods of Egypt, to bring revelation to the Egyptian people primarily, and thirdly, to make a distinction between the Hebrews and the Egyptians. So with that said, let's jump into the text. If these are indeed acts of judgment against the gods of Egypt, we can and should associate each plague with a god of the Egyptian people. And of course, for the original hearers, this would have been obvious. When God attacks the Nile, it's not just a random river. That Nile is the source of life. That Nile is a God that they worship. When God rains hail from the sky, it's not just a random storm in their mind. It's that the God of heaven has been destroyed by the God Yahweh. And they would have viewed these events as the gods kind of warring it out and battling it, and Yahweh triumphing after God after God. Now, we don't see or imagine these plagues from the perspective of the people, right? And typically we don't. We see them as kind of random, arbitrary acts. Which, strangely enough, is our view of God's judgment today. Like, it's just random. It's like the angry God on the throne chucking lightning bolts. But back then, like in their setting, this would have seen, these not would have been like natural events, right? But they would have seen to be like things that they were used to seeing, but on a totally different level. Let me explain that for you. When you look at the seasons of the land of Egypt back then, and they're typically the same today, there was 3 key seasons. Okay? You had season 1, and that was the inundation season, and that's where the Nile River floods and irrigates the crops. Now, this happens between July and November, and this is extremely important. This is the moment that they can plant, and if there's no water to irrigate the crops, they can't plant any crops, and they're in for a rather difficult year. And like I said, the importance of the Nile for Egypt cannot be understated. Okay, currently about 95% of Egyptians live along the Nile, and that's only 5% of the land. You have 95% of the I think it's 80 to 90 million people living on just 5% of the land. It's because that's where the life is. The rest is desert. So if anything happens to the life source, the nation is quite ruined. Okay. Once the flood subsides, the crops are planted in the churned up soil. And then we enter into season 2. This is mid-November to March, and this is where the crops grow, and then they're harvested towards the end of mid-March. And then lastly, you have the summer season where it's hot. This is from mid-March all the way back until the time the Nile floods. And this is where the hot Khamsin winds blow up from the Sahara Desert, and it's very dry. Now, if we keep this pattern of their yearly rhythm in mind, you can observe something rather interesting through the plagues. Okay? So the first is the Nile turned to blood. Now, Pharaoh doesn't seem to take this to heart too much. He's not too concerned by it. One, because his Egyptians replicate it, and it's not shocking. Okay. Now, typically, I grew up with understanding that it was literal blood, right? But there's an interesting passage. Okay, in Exodus 7, verse 19. Okay? It says that the water was turned to blood throughout the whole land, and it says, even in the vessels of wood and in the vessels of stone. Now, this is a Hebrew idiom. An idiom is a cultural saying that really doesn't make sense outside of that culture. And so our translators have added words in to help us understand it. And there's actually, the word vessel isn't in the original text. It just says that in the wood and stone. Okay? And it's an idiom for the outlying regions, right? And in my language, we say the boonies or the sticks, like out in the wilderness. Even there was blood even in the water way out there. And typically, what they would, like, if you've been in a place where the land is very fertile, the soil is very rich with nutrients, you would have kind of a reddish dirt. Okay. I've been in places where it's like that. You have a red, rusty kind of dirt. And so when the Nile would flood, there would be a reddish color, a reddish tint. But what most scholars say is that at this moment, God judges the people of Israel the people of Egypt by causing an insane flood to happen, like they've never seen before. That even the outlying regions are flooded as the Nile overfloods its banks. Okay? And that's not helpful for planting crops. That's actually disastrous. How can you plant crops when there's so much water? Now, in the Egyptian mythology, another god that they would worship would be the frog god. Okay? Or a god that had the image of a frog, And that's because once the Nile floods and then subsides, there's frogs all over the place, right? And the symbol of the Nile flooding is a symbol of new life coming, new crops coming that season. And so frogs represented a new life. And notice the second plague. There's a massive amount of frogs that could easily have followed a massive flood. And then 8:13 says that they piled up the frogs after they had died. And it specifically states that they were piled up in heaps so that the land stank. Now, what is going to come on a pile of stinking, dead reptiles? Flies, right? And that's the next plague. Gnats and flies fill the land, okay? Typically, flies are known to bring disease. They're known to carry disease, and that's what we have in the fifth plague, which is the boils on the livestock. Okay, and it breaks out. Now, it's at this moment that Pharaoh, it seems in the text, it's at this moment that Pharaoh begins to harden his own heart. Okay, or where God begins to harden the heart of Pharaoh. Okay, up until this point, he's been doing the own hardening, but perhaps this stream of events is now getting a bit too much for Pharaoh. Now, let's continue on in this pattern. In 6, if you are around animals full of disease, the natural next step is going to be diseases on human beings. And that's exactly what happens. Plague 6 is boils on humans. Okay? And this is the moment where things kind of shift in Pharaoh's heart. Notice in Plague 7, the pattern kind of ends, right? If the Nile flooded its banks, you'd have lots of frogs. Lots of dead frogs bring lots of flies bring lots of disease. On animals brings disease on human beings. And it's kind of these natural events, but on cosmic levels like they've never seen before. Okay? And then, but through this, God has crippled a part of their economy. He's crippled the cattle, right? The livestock. They're all dead as a result. Then God sends the hail to wipe out what remains of the livestock, and as well to wipe out the some of the crops. Okay, this is now in chapter 9, and we can observe something very interesting. Okay, 9 verse 20. This is the first moment that the Egyptians are able to express a belief in God by taking in their cattle in from the field, because they've seen what God has been doing. Again, the purpose is revelation, not just to the Israelites, but also to the Egyptians. Then in 10 verse 7, they actually advise Pharaoh to let the people go, okay? And their reasoning is, the end of 10 verse 7, is that because Egypt is ruined. Now, what do they mean by this? Egypt is ruined. Well, the author gives us a hint in 9 verse 30. Pharaoh is saying, you can let the people go. They can run. They're free to go. But Moses says, I know you do not yet fear the Lord. And the reason is in verse 30. The flax and the barley were struck down. For the barley was in the ear and the flax was in the bud. But the wheat and the emmer were not struck down, for they are late in coming up. Meaning, there's still a chance for Egypt to survive this. Okay? The cattle have been destroyed, and half of their crops, specifically the barley and the flax. But what still remains, the later crop, which has not been destroyed, is the wheat and the emmer. But the servants of Pharaoh recognize how desperate they are. Okay, and we can observe that in verse 9, in 9 verse 7, where they say the land is ruined, let the people go. Okay? And they understand that it's the God of the Hebrews attacking them. It's the God of the Hebrews destroying the nation. But Pharaoh continues to be stubborn and does not let the people go. And the next plague is the locust. And 10 verse 15 says, they covered the face of the whole land so that the land was darkened, and they ate all the plants in the land and all the fruit trees that the hail had left. Not a green thing remained, neither tree nor plant of the field throughout the land of Egypt. That means from plagues 1 to 8, Egypt's economy has been totally laid waste. They're entering into a famine because they received 0 crops that year because the God of the Hebrews has wiped it out. Now, so it would seem as though these began with a a catastrophic flooding of the Nile. Okay, and they conclude with just very unfortunate timings of a hailstorm and a plague of locusts coming through. Then the last plague, the plague of darkness. There's a very interesting thing we can observe in 10 verse 21. It says that God's going to send a darkness over the land of Egypt, a darkness to be felt. Now, in the current season that possibly they're in, because in chapter 9 it said that not all the crops are up, and then in chapter 10 we see that all the crops are up and destroyed. So this would take us to around March when they're anticipating to harvest the crops, but there are none. And the season that follows, like we said, is the Khamsin season, where the Khamsin wind blows, and Khamsin is Arabic for 50. It's a strong, hot wind blowing up from the Sahara Desert. And typically, this can also cause sandstorms. Now, in Egypt, it still today is a very dusty place. It's estimated that in Cairo, each tree can hold about 0.5 kilogram of dust, about 1 pound of dust, because trees actually take the dust out of the air. Now, in chapter 10, we learn that there are no trees. There's not a single green thing in the land of Egypt because of the plagues. So when the Khamsin wind blows, there's nothing to take the dust out of the air, and most scholars would say that it's an intense sandstorm that's coming. Now, I've been in a sandstorm before, and you can feel it, right? You feel it in your eyes, you grit it in your teeth, it's in your ears and your nose, you just feel it. And that wasn't even a bad one, okay? But some can get extremely bad, especially if there's not a single green tree in the land. But it's interesting. It happens for 3 days. And then in verse 23 it says, "They did not see one another, nor did anyone rise from his place for 3 days, but all the people of Israel had light where they lived." So imagine the Egyptian people sitting in darkness for 3 days. What are they thinking about? What are they talking about? They're looking back on the worst year of their lives, right? That started with a ridiculous flooding of the Nile. And they're wondering, is this just natural disasters? Is this just a random acts? Or is this really the God that Moses is yelling about? Is this really Yahweh, the God of these slaves? Is he really conquering us? They have 3 days silent to think and reflect. Will they join this people or will they not? And then the next plague, the final plague, is where we come to the death of the firstborn in the Passover. Now, there's a few ways to approach these plagues. You can view them in cycles, okay? The first cycle is the first 3 plagues, and there's a very clear structure to this, and you can observe it. Each cycle begins with the phrase, "in the morning," right? In the morning in 7:15, and then again in the morning in 8 verse 20, and then again in the morning in 9 verse 13. And each of those in the mornings kicks off 3 plagues. The second plague of each cycle just has the phrase, "go to Pharaoh." Go to Pharaoh in 8 verse 1, 9 verse 1, and 10 verse 1. Then what's interesting is the third plague in each of these sets has no warning. Moses doesn't talk to Pharaoh. There's no warning of its coming, and it's kind of seen as a judgment. Pharaoh resisted the first plague, the second plague, then the third plague comes without warning. Pharaoh resists the 6th and the 7th plague, and then the 8th plague comes without a warning. Then same again, you have that repeated cycle. For the first 3 plagues, it's Aaron's staff that's used, and for the last 3 plagues, it's Moses' staff that's used. Now, why is this important? It's because the 10th plague doesn't fit into this pattern, right? You have cycles of 3 for the first 9, and then the 10th plague is totally set apart, totally different. And it's to draw the people's attention to the incredible final plague of deliverance. And this is the Passover, which we'll get to in our coming session. But this is the moment where God is drawing his people out. And so the plagues, they get rather, they mean a lot more when we view them from the eyes of the people living in the land. What were the Egyptians thinking? What were the Hebrews thinking? And again, like I've said from the beginning, this was an open invitation as God reveals himself to the people of the land. Now, in the next session, we're going to see what happens as a positive response to God's revelation.